Good afternoon for all those joining here in Utah. Good morning to Tim Stratford and everybody joining from Beijing, and good evening for everybody joining from the East Coast. Welcome to the third and final session of the China Paradox Seminar. Over the past few weeks, we've had the very top policy and business leaders in the country joining us to help us think through, first, China's geopolitical ambitions and what it means to the United States. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about China's economic and trade policy and what it means for U.S. businesses. And now in today's closing session, I'm really excited. This is the session I've been most excited about. We're going to get some very actionable advice on what U.S. businesses should do about China. Given everything we've talked about the geopolitical situation, what China's economic and trade policy looks like, now we're getting down to brass tacks. Now we're going to talk about, as businesses, what do you do about it? How do you calibrate your strategies to continue to compete and win in China and prosper despite this changing geopolitical situation we find ourselves in? First off, I want to thank Harris Bricken for sponsoring the series and for moderating today's discussion. I also want to recognize and thank our partners on the Paradox series, the Orrin G Foundation, the U.S. China Business Council, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And it's great to have Jeremy Waterman from the Chamber joining us and being a part of the panel today. Before diving in and introducing our moderator, I'm joined on screen by Lou Kramer, who is a phenomenal just person to know, somebody that knows just about everybody. Lou is the vice chair of World Trade Center Utah. He's also the CEO of Colliers International here in Utah. And previously, he was the director general for the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. And in that capacity, worked very closely with Tim and Bill. So Lou, I know you've got a plane to catch. I just want to go ahead and give you a moment to welcome our participants and our panelists today.
Miles, thank you so much. What a delight it is to be with you and to be part of these series. We've had some great background. May I again endorse what Miles is saying, that this panel is superb. And I particularly want to offer our greetings to both Tim Stratford and Bill Deseret that I've known for over 3 decades. And whenever anything really good happened in China policy or trade, it was these two gentlemen that were at the heart of that. We used to say, if they don't have an answer for this problem, there are no answers for this problem. But I just cannot say enough good things about the experiences over 30 years with both Tim and Bill. I do know Jeremy brings that added expertise, but he's just a youngster compared to some of these old gray hairs here. In Utah, we also want to say that we're grateful to have the young talent such as Jonathan here as well. In Utah, we consider China not the Far East, but the Near West. For Bill and Tim, they've heard this before, that Utah considers itself not only the crossroads of the West, but the crossroads of the world. And may I just say, the World Trade Center, the Hatch Center, the Salt Lake and the U.S. Chamber, they're the crossroads of the crossroads of the crossroads of the world. So again, delighted to have you here. Let's make, as we say, let's make history and let's make some money too. Thank you so much for this opportunity to welcome you and looking forward to a great event. Thank you, Miles.
Thank you, Lou, very much for that. Really appreciate it. And a quick reminder and some more recognition, Hannah Hutt has worked over the past few weeks to pull all this together. Hannah, thank you very much for that. And for anybody that hasn't seen the first 2 sessions, I highly encourage you to check those out. The first week we had John Huntsman and Matt Pottinger, as well as a panel of several former members of Congress. 2 weeks ago for that second session, we had Gary Rochelle, Craig Allen from the U.S. China Business Council, and Matt Turpin from the Hoover Institution. Hannah, if you could post the links to their YouTube channel. If anybody hasn't seen those yet, I encourage you to check those out. 2 phenomenal conversations. I'm now honored to go ahead and introduce a good friend of mine that's also going to be moderating today's discussion. Jonathan Bench is the chair of Harris Bricken's corporate practice group. Jonathan has clients from all around the world, and he focuses on international transactions. He's the co-host of the Global Law and Business podcast. I had a chance to join Jonathan on the podcast and had a lot of fun that discussion. They're doing a phenomenal job with the podcast. And he's also a regular contributor to the China Law blog. For those who've tuned in for the past 2 sessions, you've heard me reference that. It is a phenomenal resource. I highly encourage you to check that out. We can get a link posted here in the chat so you can look at that here in a little bit. Earlier in his career, Jonathan earned a JD and an MBA from the George Washington University. So he is somebody who knows the business side as well as the legal side. And he is somebody, as I've worked with a lot of companies who are trying to figure things out in China, many running into challenges. Jonathan has been a go-to resource for me. So Jonathan, thanks for all you do. Thank you for your willingness to moderate today's discussion. I'm excited to kick back and relax and enjoy the show, which I haven't had a chance to do over the past few weeks. So Jonathan, I'll go ahead and pass the baton to you and leave it to you to go ahead and introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Miles. And I think I was planning on having you introduce the panelists. So let's call an audible here and decide which one of us is going to do it. Or maybe we just give it to the panelists and let them introduce themselves, which they'll be able to do much better than you or I will probably. So maybe
I'm happy to go ahead and do that. And as we've seen through all of this, many of the participants, they're longtime China hands, people deeply involved in China. And so in a lot of ways, our panelists need no introduction. I'm very happy to quickly introduce Tim Stratford. Tim, thank you so much for joining us from Beijing, 6:08 a.m. So we'll give you a bit of a free pass if you start nodding off at any point in this. Tim is the chairman emeritus of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. He's a managing partner for Covington and Burling in Beijing. And for many, many years, Tim had a very prestigious career working for the Commerce Department, focusing on China, including, I believe, Tim, serving as the top China, the economic, the commercial attaché or counselor at U.S. Embassy Beijing, somebody who knows China better than just about anybody else. We also have Bill Deseret, who is the current chairman of the AmCham China, and he's a senior counselor of the Cohen Group. Bill also had a very long and distinguished career working for the U.S. Commercial Service, many, many years in China. As Lou mentioned before, Bill was there back in Lou likes to say the beginning of time. We won't say that, but the late 80s, 90s, 2000s, a decade building up incredible expertise in China. We also have Jeremy Waterman, who's the president of the U.S. Chamber China Center. Jeremy has deep expertise working at USTR and in many other capacities. And then Jonathan, we've got you. So Tim, Jeremy, Bill, if I messed up any of your backgrounds, apologies. Next time I'll try to exaggerate a little bit more. But I think that everybody, when they listen to you, if we haven't convinced them yet about your expertise to speak on this topic, they're going to find out here pretty darn quick how smart you are on these issues.
Thank you, Miles. It's great to have Tim, Bill, and Jeremy today with us. Really happy to hear from them, learn their expertise, and really ask them some tough questions. We've come up with some tough questions, not anything to catch anyone off guard, but really to dig into the roots, because all of us in business want to know at the end of the day, after the lawmakers have spoken, after the trade representatives have gone back and forth, after all of the governmental interaction, how do we actually do business in and with China? That's really what it comes down to. So I'd like to start with let's start with Jeremy first. Jeremy, can you give us let's take a minute or two and give us what's top of mind for you right now when you're studying China, when you're reading about China. What keeps you up at night? What gets you excited? What worries you?
Great. Well, first, let me just say congratulations to the World Trade Center Utah, to Miles, to you and Hannah, and to your new chair, John Huntsman, Ambassador Governor Huntsman. And thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to participate on this panel with two of the foremost experts and who happen to also be good friends, Tim and Bill. Just a few quick observations. I would say first, as I sit in Washington and work with our members, obviously there's a reality, perhaps a little bit trite as you pick up the papers every day, but together with the opportunity that is China, the level of complexity, the degree of complexity, and the level of risk are increasing for businesses or for many businesses. That's not the case for all businesses, but certainly I think it's fair to say, and this has been a trend line for many, certainly economic risk, technology risk, political military risk, as we look at the overall environment in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and so forth. Obviously, ideological risk, as we see, sort of a conflict over values. We're reading about that. Obviously, again, China remains an opportunity. It remains a critical market for so many of our members, but that level of risk is now, and it has been for a while, that is boardroom level risk. And China occupies a considerable amount of I think, time every day for every company that's doing business in China, or at least for many, certainly for companies with investments in China, but also many exporters. Second, I think it's fair to say China is increasingly on its own path, irrespective of what U.S. policy is, what other policies are doing. Not to say that U.S. policy doesn't matter, not to say that the policies of the European Union, European Commission, or other governments don't matter, but China has a path. It is far more confident today, and it is moving forward very assertively on that path. I think this was one of the takeaways from Alaska. Perhaps the new administration was a bit surprised at the level of assertiveness of the Chinese side. I think there certainly continues to be room for cooperation. An enormous amount of business is getting done each and every day. There's, I think, room for cooperation in the policy space, but I think it's fair to say that perhaps that space for cooperation is narrowing somewhat. And obviously that's a concern, that's a challenge for policymakers and for businesses. I think fourth, I am in Washington and spend a lot of time on U.S. policy vis-a-vis China and analyzing Chinese policy vis-a-vis the U.S. and how it impacts business. I think it's clear that this administration, wants an extended period to, first of all, to number one, focus on COVID recovery. China is not at the top of the agenda. In fact, I think COVID recovery to bolster the economy, infrastructure, obviously the vaccine rollout and getting the virus under control. Also addressing some of the social divisions here at home. I think the second priority for the administration is working with partners and working with allies and partners. And the third priority, I think, a little ways down on the list is bilateral engagement with China. And we're already seeing that, where there's much more energy directed toward priority one and priority two than actually engaging with China. And that's a little bit frustrating for business, quite frankly, because business to a degree does ride on government to government engagement. Government to government engagement helps companies solve problems, has historically helped open the market further. And we're in a bit of a lull, I think, there, even as there's a tremendous amount of insecurity and a lack of predictability about the course of the relationship. I think, to that point, I would just conclude business would like to know more, I think, about the future of the 2020 agreement. That's the so-called the phase one agreement. What is this administration's approach going to be on defensive issues, on sanctions? Because business needs to be able to plan for the future. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to talk about tariffs and other issues, but I'll leave it there and look forward to comments of others.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bill, can we go next to you? You've had a long track record in China on the ground. Really curious what your thoughts are. Feel free to comment on anything Jeremy said, but also just to provide your input on what's top of mind for you right now.
Sure. First of all, again, thank you for having us organizing this great event. Miles, I am not the chairman, the present chairman of AmCham China. The only reason I mention that is if the present chairman got word that I was speaking on behalf of AmCham, I would lose my whatever I got from AmCham. So anyway, I'm a former chair and also
Chairman emeritus. Good.
No problem.
Sorry about that, Bill. I'm glad you corrected the record on that one.
That's okay. I'm trying to save my own neck. And also a senior counselor at the Cohen Group, which is based here in Washington. Jeremy, I think, laid out a really good context and framework for what we're going to be talking about. I would just like to highlight three things, and it was a great Utahan, Ambassador Huntsman, that told me it's okay to state the obvious. So I'm going to take that principle today and hope, I don't mean to offend anybody, but sometimes it needs repeating and it needs emphasis. I would say I'm going to focus on three things, and there's obviously a lot of overlap with Jeremy. The bilateral relationship is evolving. China is evolving, and I think our businesses have to keep up with that. Past success in doing business in China is certainly no guarantee of the future or even present success. So it's going to take more effort to follow what the U.S. government is doing and saying, what the Chinese government is doing and saying, and what the Chinese market is saying. So that is one point that folks like me, folks like Tim, who've been around forever, we also have to evolve with the changing environment. Another point, it also builds on Jeremy's, that we don't want to decouple, at least not to the extent that some folks had been advocating, especially in the past administration. I think decoupling too much will do more harm than good. We all know that we are interdependent right now, both countries economically, and the 700 billion two-way trade is one indication of that. I think barring national security considerations, that we need to have as little decoupling as is reasonable and feasible. And I would say a third point, which is talking about the present administration. We've heard the president talk about extreme competition, which includes cooperation, but it is extreme competition. And how this administration, I believe, will be more strategic, and I think businesses will be focusing on that, more strategic to include perhaps more benefit for US companies, a whole of government approach to address challenges we see from China, and as Jeremy mentioned, a multilateral approach, and focus on strengthening ourselves here at home. And this has got to be a major focus. I know already with the infrastructure bill that has been proposed, this is part of it, along with education and R&D. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Tim, we'd like to get your input as well. And I'd also like to take a second and thank you from all of the other China-focused lawyers who you have fostered over the years. I know that you're part of the chain stretching down. It's not a big group of U.S. trained lawyers who have focused on China. So thanks for blazing the way for a lot of us to really dig in and feel comfortable in the space, in the language. So glad you're visiting on an early morning for you, and look forward to what's top of mind for you right now as you're sitting in Beijing.
Thank you, Jonathan. And it's really an honor to be part of this conference. I'm really proud as someone who calls Utah my home state to see such a great conference. And it's also great to be with my good friends, Jeremy and Bill. I think what I have to say is similar to what we've heard, but I might put it in a little bit different terms. It's been the conventional wisdom for at least a couple of decades that if you're a company that really wants to grow in a significant way, you need to have a China strategy. And you need to have a China strategy, first of all, because for many industry and service sectors, China is the largest, fastest growing market in the world. And if you don't participate in that, you're going to lose out. And you're going to be put at a disadvantage next to your competitors, particularly if you're in a high-tech sector, because you need a lot of revenue to build a base for continued R&D investment. And if you don't get the revenue from participating in the China market, you're going to fall behind. Another reason is if you source products, then China has been one of the most lowest cost suppliers. And if you weren't getting that supply, then your competitors who are going to be more competitive than you. And third, you have to have a China strategy because either people that source from China or Chinese competitors themselves may be competing against you right in your hometown. So because of all those ways, you need to understand the way China will affect your business. Now, what I would say is that the conventional wisdom is still largely true, but there are some important qualifications that now, in this new era, to use one of President Xi's terms, there are new qualifications that we have to consider. The first is that even before the recent trade war and so on, a number of companies were starting to move some of their supply base out of China to some of the other countries in the region, or maybe to Mexico, because China was starting to get a little bit higher cost in some ways. And that represents the growth in the standard of living, the pay scale of workers and so on. And so that's not a bad thing, but it means that China has not always been the lowest cost producer anymore. So that's one qualification. But the other qualifications, I think, are in some ways even more significant. The U.S. and China have entered a new phase in their relationship. It's a dramatic shift. It's a shift in the tectonic plates, where the assumptions of the relationship over the last 40 years are no longer regarded as true by either country, and they have to reinvent the relationship. And we're only at the very beginning of that process of reinventing the relationship. And we saw how early we are when we watched the clips of the meeting between the U.S. and the Chinese negotiators in Alaska. The fact that there was so much acrimony shows that they're at the very beginning of a negotiation where they're just positioning themselves both vis-a-vis each other and vis-a-vis their home markets. And what's the repositioning all about? Well, the two countries no longer regard each other as reliable economic partners in the same way they did. And so on the one hand, the U.S. is looking at greater self-sufficiency in some key products and goods, and looking at supply chain resilience and some of these things. And China also believes that the U.S. is no longer as reliable an economic partner. This was demonstrated during the trade war, when the U.S. cut off certain key technologies or other types of supplies for China, and started putting tariffs on Chinese goods. And so this has gone back and forth. So each country is trying to not be so vulnerable to possible actions of the other country. So in China, they're trying to become more autonomous in key technologies and products, and they're trying to rely more on their own domestic supply and consumption to fuel their economy. Now, this is the direction that things are going, but we're certainly not in a state of decoupling. We're in a state where there's a transition going on. And so what this means as a practical matter for companies is the conventional wisdom is still largely true, but you also need to understand what are the policies of the Chinese government and what are the policies of the US government vis-a-vis your own industry sector. Is it high technology? Are the Chinese welcoming your investment, but in fact, they're also hoping that they become self-sufficient and don't rely on foreign suppliers anymore? And what sort of controls might the US put on that, or on inbound investment from China? So you really have to understand the policies of the two governments with respect to your particular sector. And the other thing I would say is that as each country is sort of imposing new policies and regulations, you also have to be very attentive to this to make sure that your company is complying with them all. And both governments are putting new emphasis on law enforcement. Chinese companies are nervous about some of the things that are being done for law enforcement in the US. And foreign companies are a bit nervous about China no longer giving foreign investors the benefit of the doubt or cutting them some slack. They're really looking at whether you're following their laws and regulations very carefully. So what I would say is the conventional wisdom is still true, but companies have to be a lot more thoughtful and do a lot more homework to see what adjustments need to be made for their particular business model in their particular sector. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm going to ask this to all the panelists, and feel free to raise your hand or jump in. I think that when we're doing business anywhere, we think of it as our relationships as fundamentally somewhat cooperative, somewhat competitive. So do you see China relationships, whether that's doing business in China with Chinese companies or doing business with Chinese companies stateside, is it fundamentally different from doing business in any other emerging context? I mean, is it really that different? And if it's not, then, well, if it is, then we'd like to know how. But if it's not, then I'd like you to touch a little bit on what are some of those fundamentals that people tend to kind of throw to the wind when they're doing business with China, at least in the last 20 years, and thinking we're just chasing the golden road. We can't go wrong. It'll be fine. Let's keep moving. So long question. Interested in your long or short answers to that. Is China really fundamentally different than the way we look at doing business with the rest of the world?
Jonathan, let me just make a couple points on that, and I'm sure my colleagues will have other things to share. Business is still business, and if you have been successful with a counterpart or a partner, there's no reason to necessarily fix it if it ain't broke. I think, however, that as Tim had focused on, we really need to be more attentive to what's going on in the environment. Oftentimes in China, a partner, a good counterpart is being affected by the leadership, by the policies that come down from the leadership, much more so perhaps than in the past. So yes, business is still to be done with relationships, and relationships are still important. And yet we have to keep in mind that there is pressure from a leadership that is increasingly controlling of the economy, and that in many ways, whether it's through the surveillance, which is becoming ubiquitous, or whether it's through the social credit system, and of course our Chinese friends, the leadership controls the media. So these are pressures that are being put on counterparts, on partners. Now, having the point you made about is working with China different than working with other emerging economies. And I would say, I've touched on a little bit of that in the control that is being practiced in China. It's much more well organized than other emerging markets. And another issue, and this is coming out of the fact that China is developing fairly quickly with, as Tim mentions, rules and regulations. But compliance is an increasing challenge in this emerging market that we may not see in other emerging markets. Compliance with regulations. I've had clients specifically, especially in certain industries with environmental rules and regulations that come down that seem to be one size fits all. And in order to be able to mitigate this risk, companies really need to, again, keep their ears closely to the ground. And I'll stop there.
Maybe I'll just jump in. I think Bill's hit so many of the key points. I think it is different. There are, as Bill mentioned, there are advantages. Obviously, the system is much better organized than many emerging markets. That's something that many executives who compare their time in India versus their time in China, will reflect positively, quite frankly, on the organization of I think overall society in some respects. But obviously China has a very unique political economy. It's an authoritarian system. It's a one-party system. The party has very clear plans and objectives. It articulates those very clearly. I have an old boss who used to be very fond, she probably still is, of saying, where you sit is where you stand. And I think that's very important in your business in China to know where you're sitting, and where you're sitting in the eyes of the party, of government regulators, of your competitors. Obviously, the lines have blurred also considerably between or among the party, the government, and and private enterprise. I think in the past there was, there still are distinctions, but those distinctions are much, when you look at the totality of the way that the party exercises control over society and the economy, those distinctions have blurred considerably, and that does create, increasingly is creating issues for companies and cooperation with China in a variety of areas. So I think it is different in some very fundamental ways, and it's never been more important to know where you sit in China.
True enough.
Maybe I could just add, I certainly agree with what Bill and Jeremy have said. I first came to practice law in China in 1982. And back in those days, the only way you could enter the country as an investor was to have a joint venture with a local partner. And the key then was always to make sure that your partner had the same underlying goals for the business that you did, because and this is true any place you go in the world, right? If you find someone that wants to do the same things you want to do, then it's a lot easier to sort of move ahead in your cooperation. After a decade or so, China started to allow companies to set up wholly owned businesses here, where they didn't necessarily need to have a partner, at least in certain industries. And a lot of people switched to that because they thought it gave them more autonomy. Today, in many industry sectors, companies are feeling that even if they have the right to set up a wholly owned enterprise, they feel uncomfortable doing so because having a well-connected local partner, and by well-connected, I mean, having good relations with government entities and so on, can help them survive and navigate, all the different policies that are being applied to businesses today. So there have been different feelings about what kind of partner you should have. I would say that as both Bill and Jeremy have said, your partners can be great allies for your business as long as your interests are aligned, but they have to listen to their own government policies. And sometimes they're told, no, you're not going to source from an American supplier anymore, you have to source locally. Or sometimes they're told, if you want to get this type of subsidy or apply for this type of program, you have to do it in a particular way. So the government has a lot of means to try to encourage and push local business partners to move in certain directions. That's why you need to know your partner and what your partner wants to achieve. And you also need to understand where the government policies are headed. And if you understand both of those things, you still can be well served by having a strong partner.
Thanks to all of you. I'd like to ask a follow-up question, which is, how important do you see Guanxi being at this point in time? And for those of you who aren't Chinese speakers, Guanxi it's the influence, right? It's your own network and your ability to, as Tim was talking about, reach out to government and say, I need something moved. Can you move it for me? Or can you help me? Or what do I need to do to get past this? Tim, can we start with you? How would you say that the importance of Guanxi is more or less? And maybe if you're in a joint venture versus a wholly foreign-owned entity, is it easier to rely on your Chinese partner than to try as an outsider company to try and work closely with the government?
Well, I think, I mean, we can understand Guanxi at different levels. One is so-and-so was a classmate in college, and therefore there's a sense that you help one another. That's one type of Guanxi. Another type of Guanxi is the Guanxi that you and your organization may develop by having been here for a long time and having a track record of being responsible business partners and really making a contribution to the local economy. And the first type of Guanxi that's more personal relations, that still is useful to a certain extent, and I wouldn't disregard it. But people are limited in the Chinese government in what they can do for their friends. And one of the signature features of governance under Xi Jinping has been to clamp down on corruption and namely to sort of narrow the discretion that Chinese officials can exercise so that you don't have opportunity for corruption. So that type of Guanxi is becoming a little bit less important. But the idea that your company has established a track record of making a solid contribution and following the laws and so on, I think that still is very, very important. I wouldn't even be able to be in China right now if my firm and my own conduct in the country hadn't given Chinese officials enough confidence that they were willing to give me a green code that I could get on the airplane and fly back here. So I think it's important to be responsible and have a good track record here. And I think that's not an altogether uniquely Chinese feature. I think that it's also good to have relations with officials in Washington, D.C., and on the same basis that you may know them personally, but also you have a track record as a solid law-abiding company.
Yeah, I mean, I just would, I think relationships remain important. They're always important wherever you are, but you're aligned. Another way I think maybe of saying what Tim, or to expand on what Tim was saying, your alignment with the objectives of the party at all levels today, I think is your business aligned, I think is far more important, at least in the company, in terms of those that we work with at the Chambers China Center, than who you know. I think, you know, China, one of the things about the system is that they spend a lot of time studying and analyzing what is in their own interest, and developing policies and practices based on what they view as their own interests. And so that, to me, at least in my experience, is now much more important than, you know, having been a classmate, or, you know, it doesn't hurt, but it's not going to, if you run into trouble, if you run into a problem, that's of increasingly less value, certainly less value today than 10, 20 years ago, for sure.
I have to agree with both these guys. Indeed, if you're aligned with what China wants, you will probably do better, at least in the short and medium term, in terms of industry. For instance, Made in China 2025, which I understand is not a popular term anymore coming out of Zhongnanhai, but it's still a fact. As we saw in the 14th five-year plan, it's those 10 industry sectors. And if you're aligned with what China wants, then I think you will get good treatment. Going back to the Tim Stratford Guanxi analysis, I must say that I think it's important. Agreeing that you can't solve everything through Guanxi. But for instance, a client will come to us with an issue. One example is, okay, what are the regulations? How is this province going to actually use these new regulations or this new policy that's come down from on high? Because what happens so often in China is that different provinces, even different municipalities, will have different interpretations of certain policy directives. So how these directives are executed on the local level to many companies is critical. I happen to have a contact in that province, and it is so helpful. This is just an example, but it is still so helpful to be able to talk to that contact, not asking for anything, you know, we're not doing anything nefarious. We're just trying to get a sense for a client, where it is, where you think it might be going, and some guidance. So I agree with both of these guys. Guanxi will not solve all your problems, but if you want to help guide folks through the minefield, Guanxi still is very, very helpful.
Well, I don't disagree with that, and certainly that's an important part of how we try to serve clients, is knowing who to call and having people that are willing to really give you, you know, a clear picture of what's going on. So I certainly wouldn't disagree with what Bill has just said.
I think one of the values of having a panel like this is because there are a lot of companies tuning in that want to know, what is everyone else doing, right? I mean, to some extent, you'll be limited by client confidentiality, but at the same time, everyone's wondering, well, this is the situation facing my company. how's everyone else dealing with it, right? How's everyone dealing with the enhanced enforcement? How's everyone dealing with the COVID, how COVID has impacted supply and demand in China? So to the extent that any of you can comment on that, what are your clients, what are other businesses doing in China? Are they fundamentally optimistic about what's going on? Are they pessimistic? Are they building up more China reserves? Are they getting out of China? What's going on?
You know, I would like to just start, and I know that Tim and Jeremy will have more comments, but from what we see of American companies in China, yes, the revenues were down, profits were down a bit in 2020, but that's certainly to be expected, especially the beginning part of 2020 when China was closed down. But companies are still optimistic. Companies are saying China is still among our top 3 investment destinations. We're going to be investing more in China. We're optimistic that China will be opening up for investment in the next 3 years. There is a lot of optimism for companies that are U.S. companies that are in China right now. It doesn't mean it's all roses, but what we've seen through some various surveys with different AmChams throughout the country is that the investment environment has gotten the highest rating that it has in 5 or 6 years. So companies seem to have done okay, many companies through the COVID. I think that the tariffs caused more damage to U.S. companies, perhaps. At least it did cause a lot of damage to companies when the U.S. tariffs and Chinese tariffs were put in place. At one point, we were getting feedback that the Chinese tariffs were adversely affecting 80% of U.S. companies in China, whereas the U.S. tariffs were adversely affecting 85% of U.S. companies. So it seems that most of the U.S. companies have weathered the pandemic storm and are expecting and looking forward to this between 6 and 9% growth coming up for GDP growth in 2021.
Yeah, look, I would only add, look, China's attractiveness over the last year was quite strong. It was a place of growth when there were amidst a world of very limited or no growth. And so certainly over the last year, China has been very important to investors. I think I think that may, as the rest of the world hopefully comes back online, I think the balance may shift a little bit, but obviously China's growth, as Bill mentioned, is projected to be whatever the number is. I think the IMF just issued a report yesterday about the Chinese growth, very strong report. And so China's going to continue to be attractive. I mean, I think there is certainly a move to diversify. There is a move, the adoption of a kind of a China +1 strategy, emergence of bolstering supply chains elsewhere, a supply chain for China, a supply chain, perhaps for other parts of the world. Obviously supply chain resilience is a very hot topic, and the supply chain folks have never been busier. But there is no fleeing or dramatic relocation from China. The China market opportunity remains compelling for many, even as there perhaps companies are not making as much money in China today as they have in the past. I think Bill indicated that as well. So I think we're gonna, as the rest of the world does come online, as we see this administration's policy sort of take root, and we don't know yet We don't know yet what they're going to do with the tariffs. We don't know what their defensive approach is going to be. And I think obviously other governments are looking at a similar set of issues. Certainly a lot of the issues that the U.S. is focused on today are being considered very carefully in Europe, with their own vulnerabilities exposed by COVID, and certainly in Japan and other major markets. I'll leave my thoughts there.
I guess what I would add is sort of the same theme I've been hitting on throughout a lot of my comments, and that is it really depends on what industry sector that you're in. 2 days ago, I had lunch with a good friend who is part of a large American chemical company. And they're just having a terrific year. They had a terrific year last year. Their product was part of the trade deal of Chinese buying commitments under the Phase 1 trade deal. And they've just been selling hundreds of millions of dollars to China. And they believe that they're well positioned to continue to do that. And they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in plants in China. And so China is a huge part of their business model, and rightfully so. I also, I happen to co-chair the Information and Communications Technology Working Group in AmCham. And as I was meeting with these companies yesterday, a number of them expressed great concern that a lot of their Chinese and state-owned enterprise customers are telling them that they can no longer purchase from American suppliers, and they have to find alternative sources to the extent that they can. So they're worried about where that's going because they know the Chinese government's trying to develop more self-sufficiency in that particular sector. Also this week, I was called by another client company. They've just signed a contract for a $500 million investment in a city in China. And they said, gee, should we still be doing this? Should we be tapering down? And so we had to talk about the specific details of their industry and their own business model to see how it might be affected by these dynamics. And I think it's very important to have a sense of the uncertainty that a number of people feel. The U.S. China negotiations are just beginning. I think they're going to take a good 3 years before we really know how much, whether they're starting to see real solutions to their issues. The issues are very complicated. The U.S. has a lot of internal consultation to do before they even know what they're going to ask China and to do. And they also want to coordinate more with friends and allies, as has been mentioned. And so this is not going to be something that happens quickly. And I think my advice to our governments and also to companies is that we should, well, Mark Zuckerberg once said that the reason Facebook's so successful is that they move fast and break stuff. And he said, if you're not breaking things, you're not moving fast enough. Well, I think for U.S.-China relations, we want exactly the opposite advice. Move slowly and don't break things, because there are a lot of very positive things that have been put together over these years, and we have to proceed thoughtfully. Now, that doesn't mean to stop working in China. It means that there's a lot of work that can be done right now to help fix things. But I just think that people have to be very thoughtful in how they approach the market here at this point. And I think that'll be true for the next several years.
Tim, that's a great segue into one of our Q&A questions from James Moore. He says that China is very good at establishing its strategy, right? Telegraphing it to the whole world. And U.S. still seems to be grasping with the right way to deal with China. I feel like the last 5 years, we're starting to get something. But do you feel like we're getting there? And do you feel like, what do you feel like will be some of those key components in the U.S. strategy in this new polarized world?
Maybe I could just comment first on how we evaluate what the policies are. I've been saying for a long time that China has a special capacity of simultaneously pursuing contradictory policies. And that's not a bad or disingenuous thing. What happens is you have one policy goal and you have another one, and there's tension between the two, but you really want to pursue both goals, and you just have to work out the tension in practice. So for example, China wants to promote foreign investment into China. Are they genuine about that? Yes. But at the same time, they also want to promote their own indigenous innovation. They want to promote their own national champions. So they want to do things at the same time. And therefore, when you're, as foreign investors and foreign business people, when China has a policy, they're being honest about having that policy, but you also need to understand what other policies they have that may limit how far they're really going to go with the first policy. And so you have to understand the broader policy framework, and you have to understand how competing policies work to define and limit one another. So I think it's important as we're looking at what China's doing to recognize that they want to develop self-sufficiency, and they also want to encourage us to be part of their economic development. And we have to look at the interplay between those competing goals.
Bill, you're muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, sorry about that. I find it so interesting, especially when Made in China 2025 came out in 2015. We in the embassy were complaining so much because China seems to be so opaque. As Tim says, they'll say something and maybe they'll mean it, maybe they'll mean something different, and there will be conflicting policies coming out, and you're really not clear. But Made in China 2025, we have to thank China for being so transparent on this policy. I think eventually it ended up as a kick in the butt to the U.S. to help wake us up. So we should thank the Chinese leadership for that. And in terms of how the U.S. has responded to Chinese policies, the comment from the questioner that the last 5 years something has happened, I think we do need to give credit to the past administration for bringing to a head some of the issues that we have with China that have been detrimental to the U.S. and have hurt U.S. companies. However, I don't think that there was enough of a strategic look and enough of a drilling down to what the core issues are. And I would say among the very important core issues is state capitalism in China. When the strategy we had, and phase one did address some important things, but with such a laser-like focus on the deficit. Well, economists, I don't know any economists who won't tell you that it's really not so much an issue of China taking advantage of us as it is of savings rates, for instance, in the two countries. So I think that while the last administration did do a real solid in pointing out the issues, I think that this administration, it's incumbent upon it to approach China more strategically with a whole of government and with the idea that rather than just being confrontative with China, we need to be competitive, and that starts at home. So I think that the Biden administration is pointed in that direction. So I'm somewhat optimistic, but as Tim has said, it's going to take time and negotiation.
I think, I mean, to pick up on that point, Bill, that excellent point, it does start at home. I think this new administration clearly is emphasizing the home front, as I said in my opening kind of observation. And I think, though, in terms of how that plays out, in terms of great power competition, we don't have our Congress is very different from the National People's Congress. Let me just say that, right? So in terms of stimulus and making long-term investments in the productive capacity, our innovative capacity, that, the kinds of investments that truly will help us run faster, none of that is a foregone conclusion. It was actually, there's hope that when the Congress returns next week, they will move forward on in part funding the CHIPS Act, something that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has endorsed, to support the development or to help the U.S. semiconductor industry run faster, in essence. That was something actually that was developed by industry and worked with the last administration, worked in the Congress, a lot of support. In fact, it was authorized, but the money was not appropriated because there were qualms about spending the money. And so I think, to take this back to maybe to Alaska and the statement that this administration is committed to addressing China from a position of strength, I think that is the right statement. But because you say it today does not mean you are doing it today. It's going to take things like the CHIPS Act. It's going to take, obviously, successful cooperation with partners and allies, which is going to be very difficult. It is not going to be, Europe has its own objectives, its own industrial policy, its own exposure, vulnerabilities. Japan has it, and domestic politics, and Japan does too, and so does Korea. And so, this is really the task, I think, certainly over the next year, but perhaps over the next 4 years of this new administration to make those, to work with the Congress, to make on a bipartisan basis, to make those productive investments, and to work with industry as well, because the government doesn't create the jobs or the innovation, it's business that does. And then also to work to find those areas of overlapping interest with partners and allies so that there is a united front and U.S. companies do not disproportionately lose when, from unilateral actions like the tariffs that we've talked about.
Well, we're out of time now. I knew it would go quickly. I think before I turn it back to Miles, I want to first thank all the panelists for being available to us, sharing your wisdom. I could listen to this for hours, and certainly glad that you took the time to be with us. And let's close now with 30 seconds from each of you, your final parting thoughts, optimistic, pessimistic, or otherwise, something we've mentioned, something we haven't mentioned. Let's start with Bill, please.
Okay, 30 seconds. I'm going to repeat this talking point because I think it's critical. The AmCham in its meetings with folks in Washington, D.C., AmCham China, has an emphasis on certain issues. And we've talked about them, but I think communication on a government-to-government level, substantive communication, not like we used to have at JCCT and SNED. Working with allies is critical. National security is very important, and we want to have strong national security, but light enough so we can still do business where it's feasible and reasonable. Immigration and education are very important to the U.S., and so we want to still work and allow eligible Chinese to come and work and study. And we want to strengthen ourselves here in the U.S. So those are the talking points, and I keep repeating them at every possible opportunity.
Thank you, Bill. Tim, can we go to you?
Sure. I certainly agree with what Bill and Jeremy have said about the U.S. getting its own act together, building our infrastructure, being competitive. Let me just say a word about the U.S. China trade negotiations. I used to be in charge of those when I was at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. The difference between what we're facing now and what we did before is that China was trying to integrate itself into the world economy and the world trading system based on the WTO's rules. So they were willing to make a number of changes in order to comply with everybody else's view about how things are supposed to work. And the difference between that 20 years ago when China joined the WTO and today is that China now feels that, yeah, they want to be part of the world, but they don't think that they need to change to conform to the way the world does. They think the world also ought to make some changes to accommodate who China is. And so what we have is a country with a different economic and political system, and they say, we want to be recognized and accepted and be who we want to be. And on those terms, we're willing to be a global player. And because some of those terms conflict with the way we do things, we've got to figure out how to manage those differences. And figuring out how to manage differences is a lot different process than trying to just get them to change. And that's really what the new task is of the U.S. and other countries as we continue the trade negotiations with China. And again, we as companies and business people, we need to watch how that's going and figure out what space that leaves for us. And we also need to communicate our concerns and our recommendations to the governments.
Thank you, Tim. Jeremy?
So I'm gonna riff off of Tim's line about not breaking things. I guess, some things I think have been broken and may be broken going forward, but in the Chamber's view, we think it's absolutely essential. Well, let me back up. I think we can all agree we have some very serious challenges with China. There are some very serious national security issues with China. I mean, we haven't talked about, we haven't gotten into those in this discussion. The cyber challenges, the political military challenge, there are significant challenges. Our view at the Chamber is it's important that policymakers think through the necessary actions related to national security, but it's critical also that they do so in the least trade restrictive manner possible. And as part of that effort, it's incumbent upon the business community to equip policymakers with a fact-based cost-benefit analysis of our integration with China. And I think as Tim appropriately has highlighted, that integration with China is constantly changing. And so our cost-benefit analysis has to be constantly changing. But nevertheless, we think it's absolutely essential to take a data-driven approach. Earlier in the session, I sent along a link to everyone to the Chamber's, to the China Center's report on decoupling, which I commend to all of you in your spare time. But bottom line is we have to keep the country safe. But we also have to do so without undermining our economic recovery and our long-term competitiveness. So in dealing with those very hard realities with China, we need a targeted, a fact-based approach that is advanced at the end of the day, we hope, with our allies and partners and from a position of strength at home.
Thanks, Jeremy. Miles, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Tim, Jeremy, Bill, thank you so much. This is the point in the program where if we were doing this in person, everybody joining us live on Zoom and watching on YouTube would be giving a standing ovation out of their appreciation for you taking your time to share your expertise with all of us. Just as kind of some parting thoughts as we conclude the China Paradox series. First off, as you were speaking, each of you, I kind of imagine a car on cruise control going down the highway. And we've all been in a situation where it starts snowing or it starts raining or it gets foggy and you have to take the car off of cruise control and you grip the wheel a little bit tighter, you focus in and you figure out what adjustments do you have to make. My hope is at this point over the past few years, everybody who's tuning in today is hopefully taking the car off of cruise control, right? I think people are realizing, it's not just about getting a trade deal and everything goes back to normal, but these are long-time structural changes that are taking place. And so everybody has to take a very, very close look at their China strategy. As we think about that, we also have to remember there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? So we can't say you must do X, Y, Z because, as Tim, you pointed out, it varies significantly industry to industry what these changes mean for your industry. It also depends on the size of the company. Are you sourcing in China, selling to China? How much exposure do you have in terms of your overall portfolio? These things are very customized. And so it's critical for all of us to think through this in a principles perspective. In the coming weeks, we hope to distill the conversations we've had over the past few weeks into a short report and an action memo where we can identify a few of the principles we've identified here over the past few weeks to help companies think through what do they need to do to recalibrate their China strategy, given the uncertainty and those things that we do know about the nature of the relationship, which, Jeremy, as you put it, there are massive challenges. We didn't get into the geopolitical stuff, the national security stuff, the concerns with the Uyghur population in Xinjiang or elsewhere. Those are very, very major issues. And so we all need to think through what, in that context, what do we do as a business? Because as we've underscored time and time again, if we are in a competition with China, we need to do things that are going to make us the strongest possible in that competition. And that starts and ends with our businesses and the strength of our economy, the prosperity of our people, and the innovation that's happening here at home. One thing I'll note here is that over the next few months, we are going to do a series of very specific roundtables where we'll provide training to companies and bring in some additional experts to dive very deep to talk about intellectual property and how do you protect it and how do you watch over that in China. How do you manage effective sourcing partnerships and relationships amidst these changes. And I want to talk about Ganqi and dig deeper and provide some training to companies on how they build up Ganqi in China and what are some best practices to do that. So keep your eyes out for those emails. We'd love to have everybody join and make sure that we have a very, very strong group and that we can get very, very specific and focused in providing this training. In the meantime, if any companies have any issues that we can assist with, please don't hesitate to reach out. Be more than happy to connect you with experts that can help you, because we're all in this together trying to figure things out as we move forward in a way that's going to help protect and advance our interests as a nation, our interests as a state here in Utah, but also the interests of individual companies and individuals as they continue to recalibrate the China strategy and figure out what all this means for them. So again, thank you to everybody for joining us. Tim, have a wonderful day back in Beijing. Good evening and good afternoon to everybody else joining us here in the United States. And as you go out there, keep fighting the good fight to do the great work that you're doing to help make the United States very, very strong and prosperous on the back of our private sector. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.